Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I thank CASETA for inviting me. I'd also like to thank Jack Davis, who's here with us. Jack hired me to UNT 18 years ago and kept me there through his leadership and mentorship. And he and Gail, I'm getting ahead of myself. He and Gail introduced me to early Texas art, so I am very grateful to them. So before I begin, I'd like to position this talk just a bit. Watching a comedy charity show many years ago, I had an epiphany. George Carlin was presenting his bit on stuff, you may know it, more specifically about how our lives are shaped by it. As Carlin noted, we build houses to store our stuff, and when we get more stuff, we move into bigger houses. When we go on vacation, we pack suitcases so that we can bring our stuff, and I think Carlin would be horrified to learn that now we actually pay extra so that we can bring more of our stuff with us when we go on vacation. And this is because we love our stuff, and we distinguish it in our minds from the stuff that does not meet our standards, which we call crap. Of course, Carlin had a more colorful term for that. So my epiphany was that as a historian of art and visual culture, I study stuff and what people thought about it. The stuff they made themselves, the stuff they had others make for them, and the stuff they saw. In my case, I just study the pretty stuff. Clothes, jewelry, prints, paintings, furniture, metals, and other luxury items. I leave tools and most other practical types of things to people who look at that kind of crap. Much of my work has looked at Latin American colonial stuff and its movement around the Spanish Empire between 1521 and 1821. This Mexican painting pictures some of the types of stuff, with a sculpted Christ figure, books, prints, ceramics, and other items. And what becomes clear is that stuff was moving all over the place in every direction, and this movement is highly significant for a fuller understanding of Spanish colonial history and culture, especially in Texas. Movies and Anglo-centric early regional histories have taught us that Spanish colonial Texas was a colorless and simple place, a place with exclusively poor and rustic stuff, what we might call subsistence provisioning. All Hispanic cities and villages of the US Southwest, whether San Antonio, Santa Fe, or Los Angeles, have suffered virtually identical treatment in Hollywood films. A dirt street populated by stray dogs, children, and women in rebosos are flanked by small, rundown, single-story structures. This is seen here in an Italian poster for a Clint Eastwood Western and a film set from a Hal Roach 1941 picture. Home interiors, when shown, consist of one or two rooms that are sparsely outfitted with a chair and a table of rough-hewn wood, like the historic recreation seen here on the right. These images offer little that could be described as elegant or lavish. Life is clearly hard in the colonial Texas of the popular imagination. We may forgive filmmakers, however, because their stories and images are based on photographs and chronicles by early Anglo observers who had little understanding of Hispanic culture, or in some cases, outright disdain for the Hispanic residents of this region. The earliest Anglo writers declared their ignorance of Hispanic building practices, with one writing in the 1830s that San Antonio's houses, quote, presented a novel appearance to us. And another in the 1830s said that San Antonio looked somber and presents a very Gothic appearance. The photographers and authors furthermore saw Texas after decades of neglect by a Spanish colonial and later Mexican Republican government busy with the independence movement and the building of a new nation. Several Anglo writers in the 1830s noted the defensive appearance of this town left to fend for itself following the fall of Spain, stating, quote, "Not a house has escaped evidence of the strife." These and other 19th century sources had the effect of fixing an image of the the Spanish borderlands, especially Texas, as unremittingly poor. But the colonial life I was familiar with from my work on central New Spain and even far distant New Mexico was much more vivid. The New Spain and New Mexico I knew were filled with silks and porcelain from Asia, painted screens, full-sized, life-sized full-round sculpture, fashionable clothing, and lots of color. So after a few years in Texas wondering where that culture was, I set about looking for the breadth of colonial Texas visual and material culture in the bare archives. I based my approach to the topic on the work of my friend and mentor, Dr. Donna Pierce, former curator of the Denver Art Museum, whose work in New Mexico has gone far toward convincing aficionados of that land of enchantment that while it may have been remote beyond compare, as Diego de Vargas described it in the 1690s, it was nevertheless filled with fascinating things from across the globe. And while certainly life was difficult for many people, and some had few possessions, there was a goodly array of stuff to be found. For this presentation, I will offer a glimpse of the rich array of stuff found in Spanish colonial Texas between the 1730s and the 1830s, especially in the area in and around San Antonio, which of course became the capital in 1772, but really was the cultural center of Texas from the 1740s. Finally, I'll take a moment at the end to consider what this array of stuff may say about colonial Spanish Texas and what Texans may have thought about things, about the stuff that they saw. Let me state from the outset, however, that unlike New Mexico, the Texas I'm discussing did not have much of a developed art community. There's little known work from this era, and review of censuses reveals virtually no one identified as artist or artisan living in this region. In part, this is because the towns here never developed as fully as those of New Mexico. Changing the capital from one site to another, moving missions, building settlements without the benefit of sedentary native pueblos, closeness to New Orleans and eastern trade routes that brought contraband goods, and other similar factors conspired against a flourishing local colonial art community. San Antonio, and in fact all of Texas, was principally a military and religious endeavor. It did not develop as robust a local manufacturing community as New Mexico did. Thus, most of the Spanish colonial art in Texas, like the work we'll see today, was produced elsewhere and brought to the region. The place to begin this discussion, therefore, is with a quick review of the stuff colonists in Texas had and a little background about it. Let me begin by briefly discussing the art of the colonial missions in Texas, since I'd like to spend most of our time talking about the art in colonial homes. Like the missions of New Mexico, and here I include El Paso as part of New Mexico, the Texas sites imported an array of objects, including altar screen parts that were assembled locally, oil on canvas paintings, and polychrome wood sculpture. Here are some examples that remain in San Antonio missions. These visual works were principally made in central or northern New Spain and moved up the Camino Real into northern regions like New Mexico and Texas, both as newly commissioned works and as part of a second-hand market that allowed our area to benefit as wealthier sites farther south deaccessioned objects, as we would say today, to replace them with new items. But New Spain was not the only source of these objects coming to the US Southwest. Newspaper shipping records reveal that there was a consistent circulation of artworks among the viceroyalties, meaning that works by a Bolivian artist or Cusco school painter could travel even to this region. With the exception of some ceramics that we'll discuss in a few minutes, local artistic production was limited to sculpted portals like the spectacular facade and rose window at San Jose y San Miguel de Aguayo mission, made by a sculptor and stonemason from northern Mexico, and mural paintings that appear to have covered the interior and exteriors of mission churches. The quality of some of these frescoes is quite good. Some of them painted in an academic style, like the crucifixion on the right, hinting at the presence of talented painters in the area, perhaps the missionaries themselves or their native parishioners. Unfortunately, most of this work in the churches, both imported and locally made, disappeared with the military conflicts in the years following. Fortunately, Jacinto Quirarte has done yeoman's work reviewing the inventories for works for his book, Art and Architecture of the Texas Missions, and I recommend it if you haven't read it. But virtually no attention has been paid to what colonists owned, so that's what I'm going to do today. Let me begin with Captain Joseph or Jose de Urrutia, commander of the Presidio at San Antonio from 1733 to 1741. We don't have a portrait of him, unfortunately, so here's a photo of a historical reenactor. As the Presidio captain, Urrutia would have been involved in building the new governor's palace on the square, begun in 1722 and completed in 1749. He was in charge of the soldiers at the Presidio, as well as the growing population of civilians in the town of San Fernando de Bejar, which grew from about 200 in the late 1720s to about 300 with the arrival of settlers from the Canary Islands in the 1730s. But I'm more concerned with the inventory of Urrutia's goods compiled after his death in 1741. While I won't list everything found in his possession, I'd like to point out some of the more interesting things. And the items I'm showing here are not the objects from his inventory because they've long since disappeared, but they are examples. His clothing included a red velvet suit, another suit of pearl-colored cut velvet, a scarlet cloak, a scarlet scarf, a scarlet waistcoat of French linen, a beaver tricorn hat, a pair of glasses in a tortoiseshell case, and 3 handkerchiefs from the Mexican town of Sultepec. He had a carved wood bed, an embroidered bedspread, a small box for papers, a silver rosary, 2 large pillows, a table, bed sheets and pillowcases of French linen, other pillowcases of scarlet taffeta, a polychrome lacquer chest with tray and cast lock, silver spoons, English table knives, 20 yards of lace from Flanders, additional yardage of 2 types of French linen, 18 dozen French knives, presumably to sell, not to use, 3 pounds of Chinese silk in red and black, nearly 8 yards of brown Chinese taffeta, a Chinese porcelain basin, a silver salt cellar, 6 pearl necklaces, a walking cane in a silver sheath, 2 paintings on copper in gilded frames, a large canvas painting of Our Lady of Sorrows, and a painted screen described as bearing an image of, quote, gallivanting ladies and gentlemen. And I'll return to all those things in a minute. Other private inventories similarly reveal an array of interesting stuff in colonial Texas. In 1790, the inventory of Juan José Flores de Abrego began with his house, constructed of stone and described as having a living room, bedroom, office, and a saguan entryway, which is like a covered entryway. The house's furnishings included a wood bench, a polychrome lacquer box, 2 other wood cabinets, a leather trunk, 4 small pots from China, and gold and pearl earrings. His home was not unlike Francisco José Pereiro's, which, in addition to a living room, bedroom, and saguan entryway, had a store and office, kitchen, storage room, and several additional rooms, including, and I kid you not, a billiard room with a pool table, probably like this French colonial example from the 18th century in Canada. And the pool table was covered in Querétaro wool with ivory billiard balls and 2 long benches for the players. When José Benito Otón, described in the documents as a European, had his goods confiscated by Texas authorities in 1811, his inventory listed dozens of different types of fabrics from Europe, central New Spain, and Asia, some as bolts of cloth, Indianilla, Rouen linen, chintz, silk, Querétaro wool, and some manufactured pieces as paños, pañuelos, sarapes, and more than 100 kimonos. And these are lengths of high-quality cotton formed into banyan robes like the ones seen in these images. He also counted among his possessions goods that outfitted his home and body, including 3 paintings on copper plate, 3 crosses, though probably not as lavish as this example, silver earrings, crystal flasks, copper candlesticks, and 4 settees. The items belonging to his contemporary, Apolinar de Marbella, also confiscated by Texas officials in 1811, included 6 tables, 2 love seats, 24 leather chairs, a curio cabinet, silver and gold coffee services, trunks, crystal vessels, lockets, rosaries, medals, fans, silk curtains, scapulars, and gloves. He also had a painted portrait of a magistrate, perhaps himself, and a portrait of the unfortunately unattractive King Ferdinand VII. Finally, and not to spend the entire time reading lists of objects, other stuff found in inventories in Texas homes, shops, and storehouses, compiled between 1741 and 1813, includes such stuff as a dining room set with a long table and 15 leather chairs, a canopy bed with crystal pendants at the corners, polychrome wood sculpture of holy figures, ivory sculpture garnished in silver, coconut shell cups worked with silver, plates, platters, soup tureens, cloth made from the wool of South American vicuñas, French cashmere, jewelry and other items made of corals, pearls, diamonds, and rubies, embroidered chairs, compasses, something described only as a mathematical device, a sundial, binoculars, and at least 1 globe. What's remarkable about these inventories is that they are unremarkable. There's immense consistency in the stuff people in Spanish colonial Texas had. Whether possessing more or less of them, of poorer or better quality or materials, depending upon wealth, they nevertheless all had a similarly broad array of stuff from very diverse sources. They certainly lived far from the colorless environment movies have pictured for them. So let us take a few minutes to consider some of this stuff in greater detail. And here I use one of those Castas paintings we were just discussing. What emerges immediately as the items most commonly included in Texas inventories are textiles. Colonists living in the region and the merchants and contrabandists serving them brought vast quantities of fabric into Texas. This was, of course, in large part because Texas had no local textile tradition to speak of. And as the examples I've provided reveal, the textiles they owned were both raw bolts of cloth and pieces of clothing and household items. Needless to say, textiles from New Spain's workshops and factories, like those seen in this painting, identified as coming from Jilotepec, were well represented with jergas, sayales, indianilla, and other Mexican fabrics among the popular types of cloth. For example, in 1783, Fernando de Beramendi's San Antonio shop offered blanket cloth from Puebla, 65 yards of rebesillo, which is a striped cloth used for rebosos, a Puebla cotton shawl, 27¼ yards of striped serge, and blue and red coarse wool that also likely came from New Spain. One particularly popular textile, even among the Anglos who came to Texas in the 1830s, was the Saltillo Blanket, like the 18th century Saltillo Sarape in the collection of the Dallas Museum of Art. These colorful blankets were worn by men in San Antonio, thrown over the shoulders over white linen shirts. Saltillo Sarapes were very expensive, and one Texas writer in the 1830s explained that they cost $50 to $70. They were similarly coveted by native peoples, and settler Annie Harris wrote that a band of Karankawa Indians who had just robbed Mexican traders heading down the Camino Real rode into San Antonio wearing the Mexicans' blankets they had just stolen. Imported textiles similarly arrived in truly astonishing quantities. When San Antonio resident Marcos Vidal was arrested in 1776 for smuggling goods from Louisiana, for example, he had chintz from Holland, linen from Germany, shag from England, cloth from Spain, and ribbon from Italy. Barramendi's 1783 inventory similarly offers a great quantity and diversity of imported European fabrics, including cloth from Brittany, Rouen, Barcelona, Granada, and Flanders, in addition to examples from China and central New Spain. Yardage and manufactured items of Chinese silk appear in many inventories compiled in 18th and early 19th century Texas. Residents from merchants to common soldiers owned this luxury fabric. A 1790 inventory of goods for provisioning the cavalry company in San Antonio listed black and white silk stockings and more than 45 yards of loose silk. While Asia was not the only source of silk, it's likely that much of this fabric reached Texas thanks to the Manila galleon that brought luxury items from Asia to Acapulco. And there are some wonderful anecdotes about how greedy merchants would pack some of those ships, leaving Manila so full that they didn't include enough water and food for the crew. And so the ship would, its staff would die, and yet the ship would ride the current and end up bumping into the coast of California, where its goods were salvaged and shipped on down into central New Spain. Anyway, brought luxury items from Asia to Acapulco, from where it was carried by donkeys and carts to Mexico City for sale in New Spain or shipment to Europe. Trade fairs moved these items up the spine of Mexico to Texas. San Antonio's residents, in particular, relied on the trade fair in Saltillo as a major economic factor. In fact, José de Urrutia, who we met earlier, is documented as trading at Saltillo, likely buying luxury goods I listed after selling the 95 rams he drove down to sell at the fair in the 1730s. The Saltillo and other trade fairs thus became a major means to disseminate the Manila galleon's Chinese, Japanese, and Philippine goods throughout New Spain. In doing so, the fairs fostered a taste for the same Asian and Asian-influenced luxury items that would characterize the chinoiserie popular in Europe. When it came to clothing in 18th century Texas, like the rest of New Spain, red was definitely the new black, as colonists traded in Spain's dark clothes for Asian-inspired colors, especially red, which is ubiquitous in Texas inventories. Texas was definitely an early participant in this aspect of chinoiserie. This delight in Asian-looking things also affected the patterns found in New Spanish textiles and the designs painted on furniture. In this slide, we see a lot of red reflecting the Chinese-influenced taste, as well as Asian-inspired kimonos in the seated figure playing cards. But also note the designs at the bottom of the screen that are inspired by Asian lacquer painting. It should be noted, however, that the dye that made locally manufactured clothing red was derived from the cochineal bug that inhabited the pulque-producing maguey plant in central and southern Mexico. The cut of the clothing was sometimes Asian, as with the dozens of kimonos Texas colonists owned and sold, but was more commonly French, as Texans, like other Mexicans, developed a taste for French fashions with the coronation of Philippe of Anjou, better known as Philip V, as King of Spain in the early 18th century. Thus, we get a glimpse of the cultural interchange that Texas and other regions of New Spain shared. While we're on the topic of items worn on the body, we cannot avoid discussing jewelry. Pearls, gold, silver, diamonds, ivory, emeralds, coral, and jet formed into medals, rosaries, earrings, necklaces, bracelets, and hair combs, most of it likely made by gifted artisans in central New Spain, adorned the bodies of men and women in colonial Texas. These items not only constituted personal adornment, as seen in this Mexican portrait at the San Antonio Museum, but also functioned as investments and even currency in the perpetually cash-starved American colony. Like their peers elsewhere in New Spain, Texans preserved their wealth in jewelry, which was both easy to liquidate and had the great benefit of maintaining its value, something not always true of currency. José de Urrutia, whose inventory we discussed at the beginning, owned jewelry long after his wife died, presumably for this reason. This slide shows an example of jewelry found at excavations at San Antonio missions, with crosses made of what appears to be lapis lazuli and topaz, not unlike the diamond cross worn in this portrait from the Denver Art Museum, and rings with unknown stones like those worn in Cabrera's image of St. Gertrude in the Dallas Museum of Art collection. Since fabric, clothing, and accessories dominate colonial inventories, let's spend a moment discussing the social significance of these objects. Clothing, then as now, is a marker of social status. In the Casta painting seen here, and remember these were the series of the racial combinations in New Spain, the elite Spaniard and his family wear quite different clothes from the Indian and mixed race family on the right, and the Apache Indians, so-called, at the bottom, a painting similar to the example in the Dallas Museum of Art's collection. In colonial Texas, the Spanish government actively participated in the use of clothing and textiles as devices of social negotiation. Among the many inventories from Texas's colonial archives are records of gifts given to Indians. A common feature within these documents is the designation of selected pieces of clothing or fabric for the indigenous elite, such as the 10 garments of blue and red wool with silver braiding for the captains of the Comanches and other northern nations with whom the Spaniards had a peace treaty in 1793. Clearly then, the Presidio commanders and their superiors recognized a benefit in using clothing to reinforce social standing, augmenting native elite regalia with items awarded by the Spanish crown. But clothing also challenged the state's social engineering. It's a well-known maxim that colonists throughout the Spanish Empire wore their wealth, even if the visual representations of race and class in the viceroyalty, specifically some of the Casta paintings like those seen here, equated dress with social status, with French-style silk gowns reserved for Spanish women and striped wool and cotton rebosos and other lesser items designated for mixed-race Black and Indian women, and nudity and feathers for the unconverted. Despite sumptuary laws and the social mores depicted in these paintings, the reality was much messier, and new Spanish critics routinely lamented that mestizas, mulatas, and even slaves wore fine clothing and jewelry, and in doing so, passed for their social betters. As Magali Carrera has pointed out, this passing and blending visually subverted the hierarchy of the society of castes. But so great was the new Spanish love of fine clothing among all groups that Viceroy Felix Berenguer in 1800, quote, lamented the excessive luxury in suits and dresses that he blamed for the ruin of colonial families. Within the colonial settlements of San Antonio, Nacogdoches, Los Adayes, Espiritu Santo, and elsewhere, the acquisition of fine textiles was clearly the readiest opportunity colonists had to visibly demonstrate increasing status and wealth. It stands to reason that the social negotiation through clothing was more possible and possibly more subversive from the state's perspective in Texas, where Canary Islanders, mixed-race people, and other traditional non-elites were brought to the region with the promise of elevated social station, even becoming hidalgos or minor nobles. Anxieties of status between Presidio military families and the newly arrived foreign settlers have been amply studied by Don Chipman. Dress undoubtedly was a daily reminder of this tension. In a frontier territory settled by people promised social improvement for their participation, clothing was consequently a vital and visible participant in this social game and its constant public display. To return to the inventories, the stuff inside Texans' homes was similarly interesting, with perhaps the most spectacular items being the bounty of the Manila galleon. Urrutia's inventory included a Chinese porcelain basin. Valued at 16 pesos, the basin was one of the most expensive items in his inventory, suggesting that it was quite large. Other Texans owned similar exotic specimens, such as Juan José Flores de Abrego's small pots from China. As with clothing, chinoiserie and the taste for Asian-inspired stuff affected home decor as well. The Central Mexican Mayolica pottery known as Talavera Poblana was immediately affected by Chinese porcelains, and soon Mexican wares displayed similar decorative motifs and blue on white coloring. These too adorned Texas tables, and platos poblanos, as they're described, appear in several inventories. The pottery shards seen here came from excavations in San Antonio. Not only have these been found at home sites, but also at missions, as parishioners donated luxury goods to the church as acts of Catholic charity. The volume of these types of artifacts reveal, like the inventories, that Tejanos brought Talavera pots, like the examples seen here on the left, to this area in great quantities, carefully transporting them in leather trunks called petacas, which we will see in a moment. These works then moved up the Camino Real to the delight of colonial Texans, and they serve as another example of the cultural confluence that allowed even far distant regions to share in Moorish, Chinese, and Mexican forms. Pottery from other parts of New Spain was present as well, including ceramics from Tonalá and Campeche, as seen in this slide of excavated fragments, with sample intact examples below. And excavations in San Antonio, including recent digs on the Alamo Square, seen on the right, reveal that Texans also possessed European ceramics, as well as local Native American pottery, acquired from Indians in the surrounding area. Imagine, therefore, what Pedro de Berramendi's grand table with its 15 carved wood chairs looked like, decked out with Chinese porcelain, Puebla mayolica, red Tonalá ware, and silver dishes. Moreover, this grand house boasted tile walls, with tiles likely also brought from Puebla for a glittering and very colorful space. But to return to the Asian influence in Texas, the most obviously Asian-inspired items in any Texas document, however, was Urrutia's painted screen featuring those gallivanting ladies and gentlemen. Japanese painted screens called biombu, the Japanese version of byobu, byo meaning protection, bu meaning wind, may have appeared among the earliest shipments carried by the Manila galleon to Acapulco as early as the late 16th century. The first documented byobu, which became biombo in Spanish, arrived in 1610 with goods sent to New Spain by the Japanese shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu. He sent up to 10 more in 1614. By the 17th century, these gifts fueled a fashion for biombos in the homes of the viceregal elite. Soon, artists in Mexico City and Puebla used their own ingenuity to build and paint colonial versions. Biombos are classified by where they were used in the owner's home, although the movable objects could be placed anywhere homeowners desired privacy or ornament. Biombos de cama, as the name suggests, were made for the bedroom. Others were made for the estrado, or parlor, where homeowners entertained their guests seated on pillows on a low platform. The biombos rodastrados, meaning biombos that surround the estrado platform, framed the sitting area and have been likened to a theatrical backdrop for elegant reunions. Urrutia's biombo in Texas may have been this latter type, since his inventory includes several cushions and pillows, which may have served as seating in his own estrado or parlor. Urrutia's biombo, with its image of gallivanting ladies and gentlemen, may have looked like an example now found in a private collection in Mexico City, or a similar example at the Denver Art Museum. This recreation scene has been likened to the contemporary French fashion for paintings of the fête galante. Other biombos pictured Greco-Roman mythology, local history, allegory, genre, festival scenes, urban views, and moral lessons. Unfortunately, of the 3 biombos listed in Texas inventories, only Urrutia's explains its subject matter as the gallivanting scene. The Dallas Museum of Art, of course, has an excellent example that testifies to the popularity of chinoiserie scenes in 18th century Mexico, as well as the influence of European prints on colonial art. The screen by an anonymous Mexican artist features text and images from emblems taken from Otto von Ween's 1612 emblem book, surrounded by fantasy Chinese ornaments. Other exotic luxury items in Spanish colonial Texas included garnished coconuts and ivory cigarette holders. European lore held that poisoned wine could be rendered harmless if taken from a coconut cup, but colonists in New Spain and Texas used these luxury items for drinking chocolate. Mexican artists created elegant examples from the 17th century on, and by the 19th century, embellished coconuts were a cottage industry for the San Juan de Ulloa jail in Veracruz. Examples rapidly filled European collections, part of assemblies seeking to reconstruct the universe and its curiosities within the walls of a noble palace, or later of the Natural History Museum. Texas collectors likewise acquired these works. The ivory cigarette holder, like the ivory combs found in many Texas inventories, similarly demonstrated local participation in a global trade, as uncarved and carved ivory crossed the Pacific to the delight of Latin American collectors, who surrounded themselves with ivory sculptures and secular works. The 1813 inventory of goods belonging to Texan Simón de Herrera, for example, included an ivory sculpted Christ with silver halo, perhaps not unlike the one seen on the right. In both of the examples seen here, the telltale curvature of the elephant's tusk remains visible in the sculpted figure, as the female saint leans slightly to the right and back, and Christ arches his body away from the cross to which he was once attached. Much less exotic for a Spanish colony, but nevertheless beautiful, were the silver and silk fans that appear in several Texas inventories, many of them described as pintados, and hence displayed painted decorative and figural motifs. And as a little aside, I did a project on censorship of images in colonial Latin America, and fans apparently were a great opportunity to have some rather risque images, since they could be quickly closed and put away. Kept away from prying eyes. Similarly, Texans had many, many examples of silver tableware, from large platters and soup tureens to silver coffee services and tobacco cases. The excavations at the San Antonio Plaza and Missions have turned up lots of silver spoons, as the humans have apparently then as now lost spoons in astonishing quantities. Someday, archaeologists will excavate the homes I've lived in over the year and undoubtedly turn up all the spoons that my children have lost. Within colonial Texas homes, these silver objects, along with the ceramics mentioned earlier, were stored in an array of containers, cabinets, and other furnishings. This was, after all, an age long before built-in closets, so all belongings were either hung on pegs or stored in freestanding movable containers. Few, of course, were as spectacular as the marquetry chest from Goa in the Dallas Museum of Art's collection, with its ivory, mother-of-pearl, and tortoiseshell decoration, which offered its owners both storage capacity and display space. This product of the Manila galleon trade is a particularly lavish and large work suited only for the wealthiest homes. Items this large would be exceedingly difficult to transport overland for the distance required to reach Texas. But smaller items definitely reached our region. Several colonial Texas inventories mention Periban chests, referring to the woodworking done in Periban in today's state of Michoacan, home to indigenous artists who had created painted lacquerware since the pre-Columbian era. In the colonial period, Periban tables, boxes, chests, bowls, and other items were collected by the breadth of colonial society and were exported to Europe. A 1797 inventory notes that Texans purchased Michoacan chests at the annual trade fair in Saltillo. The items were created by painting in dark lacquer and burnishing each of several layers. The designs were incised into the lacquer and filled with red, blue, green, yellow, orange, black, and white pigments. Although the Texas inventories are unfortunately silent on the decoration, most Periban work depicts heraldry, mythological characters, fantastic creatures, or courtly figures surrounded by vegetal decoration and intricate strapwork. The chests could be quite large. Texan Juan Flores de Abrego's example was likely a particularly fine work, as it is described in his inventory as new, with a lock and key, 1 1/8 yards long. A very common receptacle in colonial Texas homes was the petaca, a word derived from the Aztec petacali, referring to bundled fibers. During the colonial era, craftsmen made petacas of leather and wood and covered them with designs of leather applique and agave thread embroidery. The petaca's designs were commonly of secular themes and sometimes, like the fans, quite racy, with scenes of love triangles and dueling rivals. The Dallas Museum of Art's example is seen here on the lower left. Let's move in a little closer. The imagery features mirror images of courting as the gentleman in his French waistcoat and headscarf doffs his hat as he courts the lady holding her fan coquettishly. Their outfits, including his headscarf, are not unlike those worn in this casta painting that accompanies it. Below, our hero, still holding his hat in his hand to aid identification, battles and defeats a rival for her affections. Petacas were particularly popular for transportation of household items. Texas inventories of goods confiscated from traveling merchants were even compiled using the petaca in which the items were found as an organizing device, listing items from petaca number 1, petaca number 2, and so on. One inventory even lists a petaca from Texas, possibly suggesting local manufacture. Finally, to round out this review of stuff, although works of fine arts crossed the Atlantic throughout the colonial era, it's likely that the paintings in colonial Texas domestic inventories came from central New Spain, Mexico City, Puebla, Querétaro, or other colonial cities that had robust painting schools in the 18th century. Painters in these cities practiced regional variations of New Spain's late Baroque style with idealized figures, pastel colors, and profusely ornamented compositions. They executed works in oil on canvas as well as on copper plate, the latter chosen for both its durability and its rich colors, as seen in these examples, including the St. John Nepomuk, which is from the San Antonio Museum of Art. Urrutia's pair of unattributed copper paintings were likely devotional images, which were immensely popular among New Spain's art collectors. A 1769 Texas inventory lists 6 paintings of saints on copper plate sold to Juan Agustin Romero, possibly like these examples. Landscapes were also very popular in New Spain, although few examples of colonial landscape paintings have survived. Nevertheless, Texans had them, and in 1811, inventory of belongings of Jerónimo de Herrera listed 6 landscape paintings among his belongings. This illustrates how Texans were following the general trend in Mexico of decorating homes with secular rather than religious images. This angered church authorities, driving one bishop to issue an edict in New Spain's main newspaper, the Gaceta de Mexico, ordering Mexicans to remove the landscape paintings from their homes and replace them with devotional images. There is no evidence that anyone listened. Texas colonists also owned sculpted images as well. In 1815, Maria Concepcion de Estrada owned 6 sculpted images of saints and 2 crucifixes. The most common type of sculpture owned by colonists were sculpture groups of the Holy Family at the birth of Christ. These groups, known as nacimientos, were displayed year-round, but at Christmas became part of intricate tableaux of the birth scene. They're roughly tabletop-sized figures. Each year, visiting friends and relatives' nacimiento displays was part of the social rituals associated with the Christmas holiday. This tradition lives on today throughout the Spanish-speaking world, with the city of Sevilla in southern Spain being a particularly devoted site. But back to the Texas inventories, Juan José Flores de Abrego owned a sculpture of the Christ child described in his inventory as being 1 yard tall, in addition to 5 paintings on canvas of unknown subjects. Again, the provenance of these full-round images is impossible to determine today, but Mexico City or Guatemala are likely candidates. Records in the Gaceta de Mexico reveal that these American sculpture schools shipped their wares throughout the viceroyalties and to Europe. As relatively small work, the sculptures were easily transported up the Camino Real. In all cases, much like the sculpture of the Teresa de Avila from the San Antonio Art Museum seen here, colonial sculptors preferred lifelike polychrome figures sculpted in wood and frequently dressed or otherwise made to look more lifelike, incarnated, as the process encarnación was called, with the addition of ivory teeth, wigs, glass eyes, crystal tears, and articulated joints. Abrego's Christ child was likely an imagen de vestir, or dressed sculpture, like most similar images of the same dimensions. While I hope that this all too lengthy review of the visual and material culture of colonial Texas has altered the picture you have in your mind's eye, I'd like to finish by posing a few questions about what all this may mean to say about Texas in the colonial era. First, I think we can safely say that stuff mattered in colonial Texas, just as it did in Mexico City for the buyers seen in this painting of the Parian marketplace. Just the level of documentation alone reveals that colonial Texans spent a lot of energy and time worrying and thinking about stuff. I also feel justified in saying this because colonial authorities and colonists themselves located material culture at the very center of the idea of the colony and the empire, according to our richest visual document, the CASETA paintings we've discussed before. In these paintings, created to offer audiences in Spain and the Americas a rosy vision of New Spain's colonial social order, material culture is front and center, offering up raw materials and colonial subjects as evidence of the colony's success. Textiles, jewelry, furniture, paintings, and other manufactured items all appear in these paintings to testify to the robustness of the colonial enterprise. Likewise, the Spanish crown actively participated in the collecting and displaying of stuff for political ends, from the booty sent to Europe following the conquest, to the re-gifting of these objects between monarchs, to the collection of items for the new Royal Cabinet of Natural History at the end of the 18th century. It's not a huge leap to think, therefore, that colonists, even in far distant Texas, paid attention to what ownership and display of these items communicated within their environments. Moreover, the Texas documents reveal time and time again that there was in this era a persistent anxiety over stuff. We've already mentioned the problems with dressing outside of one's assigned station. Contraband was a more local example. Unlike New Mexico, which relied solely on the Camino Real and trade with Indians for its stuff, Texas was right next to Louisiana, and contrabandists brought lots of stuff to this region. For the Spanish state that regularly participated in gifting stuff and picturing stuff as evidence of an orderly society, contraband highlighted the problem of infiltration by foreigners and of lost taxation revenue, and had dangerous powers to permit colonists to define themselves in manners contrary to national interests, and consequently to transform culture in unforeseen and undesirable ways. In other words, getting so much stuff from all over the world gave colonial Texans a confidence that worried Spanish authorities. Two other features emerging from the archival record deserve attention and help us to understand stuff in colonial Texas: provenance and confiscation. Throughout the corpus of inventories, there's a persistent declaration of where things come from, and you've heard me list them over and over again. Of course, the designation helped to distinguish one type of item from another for the convenience of those who interpreted the inventory, and also to assign value. Ceramics from China were more valuable than ceramics from Puebla. Owning a Michoacan chest was better than a local juniper box. But the awareness and articulation of provenance additionally revealed Texas colonists as participating in a widespread Western anxiety in the 18th century: taste and self-fashioning as a person of taste. Far from existing on the fringes of an empire, cut off from the European and Central Mexican discourses on tastefulness and style, the inventory's virtual obsession with identifying provenance, like the chinoiserie items mentioned earlier, shows colonial Texans' keen awareness of stylishness, and that stylishness was to be acquired from an array of sources. How does this change the way we think about colonial Texans? At the same time, however, I can't help but wonder what the obsession with provenance may say about the local notion of self and other. Some scholarship on Latin America's viceroyalties argues that colonists identified first with their own town rather than the larger viceroyalty or empire. Everyone else was an outsider of greater or lesser difference. But even if they may not have identified with the outsiders, colonists certainly developed tastes that reflected foreign influences. At the same time, each inventory or conversation that repeated the distant provenance of the item simultaneously connected Texas to the outside and retrace the distance between this part of the world and that. For the individual colonist, the foreign item described as such may have made him feel far from the imperial center, but somehow at the same time closer to it. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you about the confiscation inventories. Outright confiscation or simple temporary embargo for inventorying accounted for many of the lists of stuff in colonial Texas. Goods were confiscated and embargoed primarily to search for contraband, but also for political reasons. I've already mentioned several inventories from 1811. These were compiled during the so-called Las Casas Revolution, a short-lived anti-royalist coup in San Antonio. As part of seizing control, Juan Bautista de las Casas confiscated the goods of those he perceived to be loyal to the crown. The archival result was a series of inventories, but the act was a statement of power, claiming and recording the items belonging to the enemy, classifying them and categorizing them in preparation for sale or other distribution controlled the objects and the person who owned them. Giving them back was a beneficent act. So the stuff that I discussed today should surely be seen as more than mere decoration. While all this amounts to, at this point, to musings and little more, I think it's safe to say that there was great stuff in colonial Texas, that it raises wonderful and complicated questions, and that life in colonial Texas was rich and colorful and worth exploring. Thank you.